All right, so today I want to go over the 10 steps of the female ball python breeding cycle. And if you're thinking about breeding ball pythons, I'd say you really need to know the different transitions that they go through so you can really help them from the beginning through the end of the breeding season, so you can help them along every step of the way and you pretty much know what to expect. And I would say the number one, the first part of the breeding cycle, that is the pre-breeding season. So for example, if you had a female ball python that maybe has never been bred before, or sometimes I have ball python females that I'll give the year off, they don't have the body condition, or maybe you just have a pet female ball python, you're thinking about breeding it, you're pretty much in the pre-breeding phase. And in this phase, you're pretty much treating your females like every other snake. There's really nothing special that you need to do. You pretty much just feed them once a week. Keep an eye on the body condition. If they start getting too thin, maybe increase the food. If they get a little bit obese, I start thinning out the food a little bit, so it's a feed a little bit less frequent so they don't get too big. And it's pretty much in a maintenance mode before the start of the breeding season. And it's at this point where the follicles, the immature eggs within the snake, are about 3 to 5 millimeters. And it's kind of interesting that if you actually look at some of your females that you've never bred before, there's actually tiny little immature eggs in the snake that we call follicles, and they're pretty much just kind of sitting there hanging out the whole time at about 3 to 5 millimeters, and they don't start growing until you start breeding them. All right, so number 2 is female selection. You really want to select your females for the breeding season based on their body conditions. So for example, this is actually a male bamboo ball python around my neck, but if this was actually a female, it would have, a real good chance at laying eggs because it has really nice body condition. Pretty much anything smaller than this, if it's as long as this, but if it's really super skinny, what I would actually do is I would give them the year off and I would continue to feed at an increased frequency, trying to get some weight on them till they're at least up to a good body condition. Like Bobby here, he eats pretty well. It's pretty amazing that as the older he gets, it seems like the less I feed him. Now I only feed him maybe every 2 to 3 weeks and he still maintains pretty good body condition. But essentially what I do at the very beginning of the season, I think I have like 35 females and I go through all of them. And this year I only picked out 18 of my fittest ball python females. Pretty much gave the other ones the year off because they don't have the body condition, or maybe they're not eating, maybe they've been fasting for a really long time, or another possibility is they just don't have the age. You really want 2 to 3 years on a female before you start pairing them up. All right, so step number 3 is pairing up your males and your females. And it's at this point where a lot of people will actually drop the temperature of the hot spot by a few degrees only at night. And the interesting thing is most thermostats actually have it built in where you can just dial in a night drop, set the amount of degrees you want it to drop, and set the time of the night drop, and it's just automatic every night. And as a matter of fact, I've never dropped my temperature of my room temperature or my hot spots going into the breeding season. I pretty much have the same temperatures year round, and that is 80 to 82 degrees ambient temperature and a 90-degree hot spot. And I never change it, and I've had fantastic success. Never really had a problem not dropping the temperatures at night. And another thing you want to do, especially if you're just a few weeks before you start pairing up, what I like to do is start increasing the amount of food for my females. So if I'm feeding like once a week, I'll increase it to maybe 2 or 3 times a week, depending on how big the rodents are. You don't want to feed them too much, but if you actually increase the amount of food or the frequency, a lot of times that is a trigger to get the females in condition so they can actually go through the really long fast so they can build the eggs and lay them. And if they don't have the body condition and you're going into the breeding season, I've actually done this before. My first year I paired up all my snakes, and what it really does is you'll put your males and your females together and you'll see them lock, you'll see a mating several times with your males and your females, and essentially what will happen is your females will go on a fast, but they won't lay eggs because they don't have the body condition. And I would say as far as the frequency of pairing up, usually what I do is I put the males with the females and I leave them in there for, I usually do like 3 to 4, maybe 5 days for the males, and then I separate them. You can actually separate them for the month and then just keep pairing them up month after month until you get get to a certain point, which I'll cover a little bit later on. But most people say you don't really need to pair up the males and the females more than once a month. All right, so step number 4 is what we call the glow before the go. And this is kind of interesting. The females will actually get really bright and intense. You'll see their colors are really bright and intense. Almost looks like they just shed, but what it is it's pretty much when their follicle size gets to about 25 or 30 millimeters. And it's pretty much a sure sign if that snake is glowing, you know it's gonna go. And I don't think the males do the same thing. And it's kind of interesting. I've actually looked at some of my females throughout some of the breeding years, and it seems like at certain points it looks like a totally different snake because it's so clean and bright and intense. It's the glow before the go. All right, so step number 5 is what we call egg absorption. And essentially what happens in ball pythons, sometimes with the females, if they don't get to the point where they're glowing before they go, essentially what happens is they reabsorb the eggs. And sometimes this can trick you. I've actually used an ultrasound and looked inside of my female ball pythons, and I measured the follicles to be about 20 millimeters. And I thought, all right, you know, they're starting to build. I think I'm gonna get some eggs from this girl. And then at the end of the year, they don't lay eggs, and you take your ultrasound again and look inside, and sure enough, those follicles are completely gone. They reabsorb the follicles. All right, so step number 6 is ovulation. And ovulation is when the eggs become fertile in the female. It doesn't happen to the males, only the females. And essentially what it is, I can kind of show you on Bobby here because he's not a female. This snake will never ovulate. But if he was a female, essentially what you'd see is like the lower third part of the body right here would become really swollen, almost twice as big. It's pretty amazing to see a full-blown ovulation on a ball python. Looks like it's extremely painful. It doesn't even look real. It's kind of wild. And essentially what it is that is the time when the eggs become fertilized. And people say when your snake ovulates, you get what you get, which means that essentially you'll either get fertile eggs or you'll get slugs, which are infertile eggs. And I've seen some people get quite a few infertile eggs, and I think what it really comes down to is you really have to stay on top of moving your males through your females through the entire, you know, time. I would say usually by the time I start pairing up my snakes till the time they ovulate, for me, I'd say it's about 5 to 6 months. So you really have to stay on top of it. Keep pairing up your males and your females at least once a month, all the way up until ovulation. And essentially what I do is, like this year I'm breeding 18 females. Essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all my tubs, and as soon as I see one female ovulating, I'm going to separate all my males from my females, and that is pretty much it. I've already been pairing them up for months and months. I'm pretty much tired of it at this point, and then I just call it that's good for the season, and I separate them all. And really this is the easiest time of the year, because keep in mind a lot of your females aren't eating, most of your males won't be eating, and a lot of times since you don't have to cycle the males through the females, there's really nothing to do, and since they're not eating, they're not really going to the bathroom, so you really don't have to spot clean either. It's pretty amazing. So essentially at this time of the year, the only thing I do is go through my tubs, make sure there's enough humidity in the substrate, and make sure everyone has clean water. All right, so the 7th step is the pre-lay shed, and the pre-lay shed is something I don't really track. Essentially what I do is after they ovulate, I wait about a month or 2, and then I just keep checking all the tubs. I actually check all the females twice a day when we start getting towards the end of the season, because I definitely want to catch them on time. But a lot of people actually track the pre-lay shed, and the pre-lay shed usually comes about 3 weeks after ovulation, and it's pretty much the last time they shed before they lay eggs. And you can kind of get the timing down after the shed, approximately when they're going to lay eggs based on the pre-lay shed. All right, so step number 8 is egg laying, and the females will lay eggs approximately 3 to 6 weeks after the pre-lay shed. So a lot of people look at ovulation, they'll mark it on their calendar, they'll do the pre-lay shed, mark it on their calendar, and they go, all right, after 3 weeks, I better start checking every single day for ball python eggs for this female. And what I like to do is I like to check twice a day, because I like to catch the eggs when they're still soft and pliable, and I can actually separate them by hand. I like to separate them before I put put them in the incubation box. And let me tell you, if you leave your eggs in one clump for like a day or two, especially if you left them for 2 days, it's almost impossible to separate them at that point. So I really like to, you know, catch them early. The reason I like to separate them is if one starts molding, gets a little bit moldy in the egg box, what I like to do is I like to actually take that egg, move it to a separate egg box and kind of work on it, maybe use some fungicides or, you know, try to use different techniques to try to save that egg if I can, and then it won't really affect the other eggs. Versus if you have like a bad egg in a whole clump of good eggs, you really can't isolate that egg and it's really difficult to treat. All right, so step number 9 is egg hatching. The eggs will hatch. Usually, it's, you know, when I first started ball pythons, people were saying about 55 days after they were laid, and I found almost to the day it is 60 days. Sometimes it's 65, and it really depends on your temperatures. At colder temperatures, it'll take a little bit longer. At warmer temperatures, they'll go a lot faster. And I think, you know, I usually incubate about 90 degrees. I really don't like to change off of the norm of 90 degrees, and for me, at 90 degrees, the eggs usually hatch in about 60 days. All right, so step number 10 is recovery, and that is especially for your females. And what it comes down to is when your females lay eggs, essentially what happens is you're taking the eggs away, and a lot of times I'd say maybe 80 or 90% of the time, the female will still think she has eggs and she'll stay coiled up in the back of the tub and she'll refuse food. Sometimes if you leave them in this condition, it can be a really long time before they get back on food. So what you really want to do is you want to take them out, give them a nice warm water bath. You want to clean all the substrate and you clean the tub and give her fresh substrate and everything and try to get her back on food. And what I try to do is I kind of ease her back into the food and give her a little bit smaller rodents, maybe once a week, to, you know, because she hasn't eaten in like, you know, probably 6 to 8 months in some cases. And some of these females can be extremely small. You don't really want to shock their system with a really big rodent. So I kind of ease back into it for the first meals. And then I kind of go into the maintenance stage where I try to feed them once a week until I'm coming up to the breeding season. And then I start increasing the frequency of the food. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Mario Royce asks, my snake hasn't gone to the bathroom in 2 weeks. What should I do? That is a very interesting question. And the funny thing is a lot of people will actually laugh at that question, but believe it or not, that is probably the #1 question that I've been asked over the last couple years. My ball python hasn't gone to the bathroom in a long time. What is wrong with my snake? And I'd say for ball pythons, it is perfectly normal. As a matter of fact, Bobby here, he probably hasn't gone to the bathroom in about 2 months. It is pretty incredible. You know, so I would say on average they probably eat more often than they go to the bathroom, which is kind of weird. And sometimes some of these ball pythons, they won't eat for months at a time. And especially if you have females in the breeding season, they won't go to the bathroom for 6 months at a time. Sometimes it's pretty amazing how long they can hold it. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.